In December of 1859, on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, in a plantation house overlooking the marshlands where the Ogeechee River meets the Atlantic coastal plain, a woman named Sarah, enslaved, 32 years of age, mother to children she could not claim, committed an act so horrifying that it would be whispered about in parlors and prayer meetings for generations, though never spoken of in proper company. On Christmas Eve, as carols drifted through the fog and candlelight flickered in frosted windows throughout the county, Sarah boiled her master, Colonel Edmund Hartwell, and his 3 legitimate sons in rendering fat meant for soap making, turning the season of redemption into a monument of unspeakable vengeance. You are now listening to Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, the tales that polite history chose to bury beneath magnolia blossoms and mint juleps. The Hartwell Plantation, known locally as Riverside, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime cotton and rice land, worked by approximately 240 enslaved people whose labor had built the Colonel's fortune across 3 decades. Edmund Hartwell was 57 years old that fateful winter, a man of considerable standing in Savannah society, educated at the College of Charleston, a deacon at First Presbyterian Church, and a widower since 1856 when his wife Margaret had succumbed to yellow fever. He was known among his peers as a stern but not unusually cruel master, a man who quoted scripture at Sunday dinner and kept meticulous records of his human property in leather-bound ledgers stored in his mahogany study. His 3 sons, Edmund Jr., age 23, already managing portions of the estate, Thomas, 20, studying law in Charleston, and William, 17, the youngest and reportedly the gentlest, were the pride of his declining years, young men groomed to inherit not just wealth, but the entire architecture of power that sustained it. Sarah had arrived at Riverside in 1845, purchased at auction in Savannah when she was 18 years old, separated from her mother and 2 sisters who were sold to different buyers that same afternoon. She had been born in Virginia, on a tobacco plantation near Richmond, and had known the rhythms of bondage since before memory began. She was described in the Colonel's purchase records as strong-built, good teeth, suitable for house or field, though it was her quiet intelligence and deft hands that secured her a position in the main house, first as a laundry woman, then as an assistant to the cook, and finally, after the mistress died, as the primary keeper of the household's daily operations. She was lighter-skinned than many of the field hands, her father having been a white overseer who had taken her mother by force, and this accident of birth granted her a peculiar and poisonous proximity to the family she served. Among the enslaved community at Riverside, Sarah was respected but feared, for she moved between worlds that others could not access. She knew the Colonel's moods, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. There was Moses, 54 years old, the head driver who had been at Riverside longer than anyone could remember, a man whose back bore the topography of decades of punishment. There was Dinah, 28, who worked in the cookhouse alongside Sarah, a woman whose 2 children had been sold away when she tried to run in 1856. There was Jacob, 19, strong and defiant, who had already received 100 lashes for talking back to an overseer. Umber Sismedam ins Nawas, bin Bidini Porden. There was Celia, 41, the midwife who had delivered half the children born at Riverside, enslaved and free alike. There was Ruth, 16, recently brought up from the fields to work in the house, still adjusting to the constant surveillance of domestic service. And there was Peter, 32, the blacksmith, a man whose hands could shape iron but could not protect his wife when the overseer decided he wanted her. These were the witnesses to what would unfold, though none of them would ever testify in a court of law. The catalyst for what came to pass began not with a single event, but with the slow accumulation of violations that defined Sarah's existence. Since Margaret Hartwell's death, the Colonel had increasingly turned to Sarah not merely for household management, but for other services, visiting her cabin on nights when laudanum and whiskey could not quiet his grief. She bore him 2 children, a daughter in 1857 and a son in 1859, both of whom lived in the quarters and were classified in his ledgers simply as increase, their paternity unacknowledged, their mother's consent never a question anyone thought to ask. The 3 legitimate Hartwell sons knew of these children, as did everyone at Riverside, and while Edmund Jr. largely ignored the situation, treating it as an unremarkable feature of plantation life, Thomas and William had begun, in recent months, to follow their father's example, approaching Sarah with the same assumption of access, the same presumption that her body was simply another form of property to be used at will. Pause for a moment and consider this. In a world where even motherhood could be stolen, where a woman's children could be her master's property twice over, once by law, once by blood, what remained of the soul? What alchemy of suffering could transform a person into something capable of the unthinkable? The breaking point came in November of 1859, 8 weeks before Christmas. Sarah's infant son, just 4 months old, fell ill with fever and convulsions. Celia, the midwife, recognized the symptoms immediately. It was the same sickness that had taken 3 children that year already, a respiratory affliction that swept through the quarters when the weather turned cold and damp. Sarah begged permission to stay with the child through the night, to keep him warm, to give him the remedies Celia prepared from roots and herbs, but Colonel Hartwell refused. There was a dinner party that evening, prominent families from Savannah and surrounding plantations, and Sarah was needed in the main house to oversee the serving, to ensure that every detail reflected the Hartwell family's refinement and hospitality. When she protested, tears streaming down her face, the colonel struck her across the mouth with the back of his hand and reminded her that her obligations were to him, not to some pickaninny, who would likely die anyway given the season and the weakness of slave children in general. The baby died before dawn. Sarah was not permitted to attend to his body. Dinah and Celia prepared him for burial, while Sarah stood in the main house kitchen, her milk soaking through her dress, her hands moving mechanically through the motions of preparing breakfast for the family that had killed her son through indifference, as surely as if they had held a pillow over his small face. At the simple graveside service that Sunday, when Moses said a prayer and the enslaved community sang a spiritual, Sarah did not weep. She stood silent, her face a mask, and those who knew her best, particularly Dinah, recognized that something fundamental had shattered inside her. This was not grief. This was something colder, something that had calcified into purpose. Over the following weeks, Sarah became unnaturally efficient, almost cheerful in her duties. She smiled at the colonel, anticipated his needs, ensured that his meals were perfectly prepared, and served at precisely the right temperature. She was attentive to his sons when they came home for the Christmas season, deferential and quiet, moving through the house like a ghost who had learned to make itself useful. The other enslaved people noticed the change and grew uneasy. Dinah tried to speak with her one evening, to offer comfort or at least acknowledgement of her loss, but Sarah simply looked through her with eyes that seemed to see something far beyond the present moment. Christmas coming, was all she said, going to be a special Christmas this year. The Hartwell plantation, like most in the region, observed Christmas with a peculiar mixture of religious observance and temporary relaxation of the normal regime. The enslaved people were typically given 3 days of rest, slightly better rations, and permission to gather for their own celebrations, while the white family attended church services and hosted elaborate dinners for their social equals. It was a time when the masks of paternalism were most carefully maintained, when masters played at benevolence and pretended that the system they enforced was somehow softened by Christian charity. Colonel Hartwell prided himself on his Christmas generosity, distributing small gifts to select house servants, and allowing an extra ration of molasses and pork to be distributed among the quarters. On December 23rd, Sarah asked permission to begin preparations for the Christmas Eve dinner, which would host nearly 30 guests, including the mayor of Savannah, a rice plantation owner from the Carolina Low Country, and several prominent merchants. The colonel granted permission enthusiastically, pleased that his household management was proceeding so smoothly despite the absence of a proper mistress. Sarah spent the day in the cookhouse with Dinah, Ruth, and 2 other women, preparing the dishes that would be served the following evening: roasted turkey and ham, oyster dressing, sweet potato pudding, various preserves and relishes, cakes and pies. But she also began another preparation, one that only she understood. In the largest iron rendering kettle, typically used for making soap from animal fats, she began heating lard, adding fuel to the fire beneath it slowly and steadily throughout the day, maintaining a temperature just below boiling, claiming she was preparing a batch of soap as a Christmas gift for the Colonel's guests. That evening, as temperatures dropped and fog rolled in from the marshes, Sarah approached Colonel Hartwell in his study, where he sat reviewing accounts and sipping brandy. She spoke softly, respectfully, mentioning that she had noticed some irregularities in the smokehouse inventory and wondered if he might inspect it with her before the guests arrived the next day to ensure that everything was properly accounted for. The smokehouse stood at some distance from the main house, near the cookhouse and rendering area, a brick structure where meat was cured and stored. The Colonel, slightly intoxicated and pleased by Sarah's conscientiousness, agreed to accompany her after his sons retired for the evening. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten chronicles of the American South, these testimonies that refuse to remain buried, subscribe to Shadows of the South. There are more stories waiting to be told, more truths that demand recognition, more voices that will not be silenced by time or propriety. What precisely transpired in the hours between midnight and dawn on Christmas Eve 1859 would never be fully documented in any court record or newspaper account, though fragments of testimony would emerge in the weeks that followed. What is known is this: Colonel Edmund Hartwell left his study shortly after 11 o'clock, wrapped in his wool coat, carrying a lantern, following Sarah through the cold night toward the smokehouse. His 3 sons, Edmund Jr., Thomas and William, were called from the main house separately over the next hour, summoned by Sarah with various pretexts: a disturbance among the animals, a fire hazard in the cookhouse, an injured field hand requiring immediate attention. Each went willingly, trusting the woman who had served their family for 14 years, the woman who had borne their father's children, the woman whose grief they had not bothered to acknowledge. The rendering kettle had been heating for more than 12 hours by the time darkness fell on Christmas Eve, its contents reaching a temperature that could strip flesh from bone within minutes. The exact sequence of what followed would be reconstructed primarily from physical evidence and from the testimony of Moses, who discovered the scene near dawn when he came to investigate smoke rising from the cookhouse area that seemed excessive even for holiday preparations. He found Sarah standing before the massive iron kettle, her clothes and face splattered with substances he initially took for rendered fat and soap residue. The kettle itself contained human remains so thoroughly destroyed by heat that initial identification was impossible. Nearby, arranged with deliberate precision, were the Colonel's pocket watch, still ticking, 3 sets of cufflinks bearing the Hartwell family crest, Edmund Jr.'s law school ring, Thomas's silver tobacco case, and William's leather-bound prayer book, each item placed on a wooden bench as if carefully preserved for identification purposes. Moses did not immediately raise an alarm. He stood in the gray pre-dawn light, understanding everything and nothing, watching Sarah as she stared into the kettle's contents with an expression he would later describe as peaceful, like she'd just finished a hard day's work and found it satisfactory. When he asked her, his voice barely a whisper, "What have you done, Sarah?" She turned to him and replied with perfect clarity, "I rendered them down like they rendered me. Fair exchange, 1 body for 1 body, 3 sons for 3 children. The books are balanced now." The discovery sent shockwaves through Chatham County that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crime itself. When the sheriff arrived with a contingent of armed men, fearing a general uprising, they found Sarah still standing by the kettle, making no attempt to flee or resist. The other enslaved people at Riverside had gathered at a distance, silent and watchful, neither helping nor hindering the investigation. Sarah was immediately shackled and removed to the Savannah jail, where she would await trial for murder, a trial that would expose uncomfortable truths about plantation life that many in the community preferred to leave unexamined. In a society built entirely upon the principle that some human beings could be treated as things, as instruments, as livestock, was it madness when they refused to remain things, or was the madness in the system itself? The trial commenced in January 1860, conducted with unusual speed, given the public anxiety surrounding the case. The prosecution presented straightforward evidence: 4 bodies, or what remained of them, identified through personal effects and dental records provided by the Hartwell family physician, testimony regarding Sarah's presence at the scene, physical evidence of the rendering process, and her own statement to Moses, which he repeated under oath, though his voice broke repeatedly as he spoke. The defense, such as it was, conducted by a court-appointed attorney who seemed uncomfortable with his assignment, attempted to suggest diminished capacity, arguing that no sane person could commit such an act, and that Sarah must have been driven to temporary insanity by grief over her infant son's death. But Sarah refused this defense. When permitted to speak, she addressed the court with a composure that unnerved everyone present. She described in precise detail the 14 years of her enslavement at Riverside, the violations she had endured, the children she had borne and lost, the night her infant son died while she was forced to serve dinner to laughing guests. She spoke of being used by 4 men, the colonel and his 3 sons, as if her body was simply another piece of household equipment. She described how Thomas had come to her cabin 2 weeks after her son's burial, how William had followed his brother's example despite his youth, how none of them had ever acknowledged the children they had fathered, or shown the slightest recognition that she was capable of suffering. She explained her methodology with clinical detachment, how she had studied the rendering process over months, understanding temperatures and timing, how she had planned the sequence to ensure each man would come alone, unsuspecting, how she had used their trust in her subservience against them. "I am not insane," she stated clearly, looking directly at the judge. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I calculated it like they calculated my price at auction. I measured it like they measured my work. I executed it like they executed my humanity, piece by piece, day by day, for 14 years. You want to call me a murderer? Then call every master in this courtroom a murderer too, because what I did in one night, they do over lifetimes, killing souls before they kill bodies. The only difference is I did it with heat and iron. They do it with law and scripture." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge ordered Sarah removed and sentenced her to death by hanging without further deliberation, scheduling the execution for February 14, 1860. But Sarah's testimony had achieved something that her attorneys could not. It had forced into public discourse questions that polite society had worked diligently to suppress. Several northern abolitionist newspapers seized upon the case, publishing accounts that painted Sarah not as a criminal, but as a woman driven to extremity by a system of absolute oppression. Some southern newspapers responded with fury, demanding that discussion of the case be suppressed entirely, arguing that it provided dangerous ideas to enslaved populations already restless in the wake of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. In the weeks before her execution, Sarah received visitors that surprised even the jail guards: 3 women from Savannah's small but persistent Quaker community, who brought her food, clean clothes and writing materials, a northern journalist who published her life story in serial form across several abolitionist papers, and most remarkably, Celia the midwife, who was granted special permission to sit with Sarah and pray. Celia later reported that Sarah seemed utterly at peace, that she sang spirituals softly to herself, and showed no fear of death. "She told me," Celia recounted years later, in testimony collected by Reconstruction-era historians, that she had already been dead, that they killed her long before that Christmas Eve, and that what she did was just making the outside match the inside. The question of Sarah's surviving daughter, born in 1857 and only 2 years old at the time of the execution, became a matter of brief legal controversy. The Hartwell estate, now managed by distant cousins from Charleston, wanted nothing to do with the child, viewing her as contaminated by her mother's crime. Eventually she was sold to a family in Alabama, disappearing into the anonymous masses of enslaved children whose lives left no documentary trace. Whether she survived to see emancipation, whether she ever learned her mother's story, whether she carried forward any memory of Riverside Plantation, these questions have no answers in the historical record. Sarah was hanged on February 14, 1860, before a crowd of several hundred spectators in Savannah's public execution yard. Newspaper accounts noted that she walked to the scaffold without assistance, that she refused the ministrations of the chaplain, and that her last words were a single sentence: "I have settled my accounts." Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field, though some accounts suggest that members of the enslaved community later placed stones to mark the location, creating a memorial that was repeatedly destroyed by authorities who wanted no shrine to emerge around her memory. The Riverside Plantation never recovered from the scandal. The remaining Hartwell relatives attempted to maintain operations, but the combination of notoriety, financial complications from the Colonel's debts, and the increasing tensions leading up to the Civil War made it untenable. By 1862, the property had been sold at auction, subdivided, and passed into other hands. The main house, which had witnessed so much suffering and horror, burned under mysterious circumstances in 1863, during Sherman's campaign through Georgia. Local tradition held that former Riverside slaves, some serving with Union forces, ensured its destruction, though this was never confirmed. By war's end, nothing remained but the brick foundations, and the overgrown fields reverting to marshgrass and palmetto scrub. The legacy of Sarah of Savannah exists in fragments and silences. She appears in abolitionist literature as a symbol of resistance, in pro-slavery propaganda as an example of the dangers of insufficient control, and in the whispered traditions of African American communities as a warning and a testament. The facts of her crime were simultaneously too horrific to speak of openly and too revealing to be honestly examined. She had turned the tools of slavery, the rendering kettle used to extract value from animal carcasses, the same extractive logic applied to human beings, against her oppressors with a symmetry that was as much poetic as it was terrible. In doing so, she had exposed the fundamental violence underlying every aspect of the plantation system, the fact that all the gentility and Christianity and legal sophistication were merely decorative coverings over an institution built on the principle that human beings could be used up and discarded like livestock. Consider, if you can bear it, what it means that this story has been largely forgotten, that Sarah's name appears in no major history texts, that the Hartwell family tragedy is noted only in obscure local histories, usually without explanation of its cause. Consider what it tells us about which violences we memorialize and which we choose to bury, which victims we honor and which we erase, which testimonies we preserve and which we consign to silence. Modern historians, who have examined the Sarah case, note its singularity. There are few documented instances of enslaved people committing premeditated murder of multiple family members, and virtually none with the systematic planning and execution that characterized Sarah's actions. Most resistance took other forms: escape, sabotage, slowdown, or the kind of small daily refusals that wore away at the system's efficiency. The very rarity of Sarah's response speaks to the extraordinary level of control maintained by the slavery regime, and perhaps also to the extraordinary level of provocation required to break through that control. She had lost everything that could be lost: children, bodily autonomy, dignity, hope, before she acted. Her crime was not a sudden explosion of rage, but the product of careful calculation, a final assertion of agency by someone who had been systematically denied every other form of power. The Christmas Eve timing was almost certainly deliberate, chosen for maximum symbolic impact. In a society that wrapped its brutalities in Christian rhetoric,
that justified human bondage through selective biblical interpretation, that celebrated the birth of a Savior while crushing the humanity of millions. Sarah chose the holiest night of the year to enact her judgment. She transformed a season of redemption into an accounting, a moment when the mythology of paternalistic care was supposed to be at its strongest, into an exposure of its complete bankruptcy. The Hartwell family, preparing to celebrate Christian charity while denying basic humanity to the people they owned, received instead a demonstration of the harvest that such systems inevitably produce. In the years following the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people were interviewed about their experiences, very few mentioned Sarah by name, though several referenced that woman in Georgia who made soap from her masters. The story had become mythologized, stripped of specific details, but preserved in its essential meaning, that there were limits to endurance, that the system's violence could be returned, that those treated as things could choose, even at the cost of their own lives, to be human in the most terrible way imaginable. For some, Sarah was a cautionary tale about the consequences of despair. For others, she was a hero of resistance. For still others, she was simply the inevitable product of an impossible situation, neither hero nor villain, but a casualty of a system that destroyed everyone it touched. The full truth of what Sarah experienced, the accumulated weight of violations that led to Christmas Eve 1859, can never be completely reconstructed. The historical record is fragmentary, composed primarily of white voices interpreting her actions through their own frameworks, filtered through newspaper accounts that had their own agendas, preserved in court documents designed to legitimate her execution rather than understand her motivations. We know the external facts, the years of enslavement, the sexual violence, the stolen children, the death of her infant son while she was forced to serve dinner, but the internal landscape, the process by which a person is slowly emptied of everything that makes life worth living, the point at which continued existence becomes unbearable, the cold clarity with which she must have moved through those final weeks of preparation, this remains beyond our reach, a space we can only approach with humility and sorrow. These stories reveal the price that was paid, by everyone, for the South's peculiar institution. They show us that the system of slavery was not simply an economic arrangement or a political controversy, but a comprehensive destruction of human possibility, a machinery that ground up bodies and souls with equal efficiency, that poisoned families and communities, that made monsters of those it empowered, and commodities of those it enslaved. Sarah of Savannah stands as testament to the fact that such systems cannot be sustained indefinitely, that the violence at their foundation will eventually erupt in forms that cannot be controlled or contained, that the human spirit, even when crushed nearly to extinction, retains the capacity to strike back with a fury that mirrors the cruelty inflicted upon it. If you wish to continue exploring these difficult histories, to understand more fully the human cost of America's original sin, to remember the names and stories that comfortable narratives prefer to forget, I invite you to reflect on these questions in the comments below. What responsibility do we bear to remember stories like Sarah's? How do we acknowledge the humanity of someone who committed acts we find horrifying? And what does it mean to live in a nation built partially upon a system that produced such tragedies? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, and they demand more than silence or simplification. The Savannah where Sarah died still exists, though transformed almost beyond recognition. The city's elegant squares and antebellum architecture attract tourists who stroll through carefully preserved historic districts, admiring the beauty while remaining largely ignorant of the suffering that created it. There is no memorial to Sarah, no historical marker indicating where Riverside Plantation once stood, no acknowledgement in official histories that Christmas Eve 1859 was anything other than a date on the calendar. Her story exists primarily in the margins, in academic footnotes, in abolitionist archives, in the oral traditions of descendants who carry forward the memory of things that were supposed to be forgotten. Yet Sarah endures, as do all the others whose names we have lost, whose stories were never recorded, who suffered and resisted, and died without leaving traces in the official record. They endure in the silences between the words of plantation ledgers, in the gaps in family genealogies, in the questions that proper history declines to ask. They endure because the past is not actually past, because the structures and assumptions that made slavery possible did not vanish with legal emancipation, because we are still reckoning, inadequately and incompletely, with a legacy that shaped every aspect of American society. Sarah's final act of rendering was also an act of revelation, stripping away the pretense of civility to expose the raw brutality beneath. In doing so, she left a testament that cannot be easily dismissed or comfortably integrated into narratives of gradual progress. Her story demands that we look directly at what was done, that we acknowledge the full humanity of both the victims and the perpetrators of slavery, that we recognize that evil systems corrupt everyone they touch, and that the bill for historical crimes eventually comes due, often in forms we do not anticipate and cannot control. This is her legacy, unpleasant and necessary, a truth preserved in the darkness of the past, waiting for each generation to discover it anew and decide what, if anything, it means for the present we inhabit.